Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about how the Cold War divides the world, and it's just like what it sounds. All the countries of the world, pretty much, everybody picks a side. Um, so let's review real quick from yesterday. Um, on what line is North Korea and South Korea divided? It's a it's a number. If you said the 38th parallel, you are correct. And which part is communist, the North or the South? The North is communist, and the current dictator of North Korea, the communist government, is who? You know this. Kim Jong Un. So that's just a quick little review about yesterday. We're going to start today by looking at how the Cold World, uh, how the Cold World, how the Cold War is dividing the world. So, third world nations were located in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Now, they were economically poor and politically unstable, and this was largely due to a history of colonialism. Um, and they suffered from ethnic conflicts and lack of technology and no education. And so each needed a political and economic system um, around which they could build their society to make it more successful. So Soviet style communism and US style free market democracy were the main choices that they could choose from. So the United States and the Soviet Union, in some cases, China, all three, used a variety of techniques to try to to gain influence in the third world. So they backed wars of revolution, liberation, or counter revolution. The US and Soviet intelligence agencies, which are the CIA and the KGB, engaged in various covert or secret activities ranging from spying to assassination attempts. But the US also gave military aid. They built schools, they set up programs to combat poverty, and they sent volunteer workers to many of these developing third world nations. So the Soviets offered military and technical assistance mainly to India and Egypt. So after World War II, rapid industrialization, population growth, and a gap between the rich and the poor led the Latin countries to ask for aid from both superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. Now, at the same time, many of these countries had unstable governments. They may have started out as democracies, but many quickly turned to military rule. And after World War II, communism and nationalistic feelings inspired revolutionary movements in these countries. So they received Soviet support. And in response, of course, the United States provided military and economic assistance to the anti communist dictators, still following in the containment philosophy from the many years before. So Fidel Castro um, led the Cuban Revolution. And in the 1950s, um, Cuba was ruled by a very unpopular dictator, and his name was Fulgencio Batista, and he had U.S. support. Well, Cuban resentment led to a popular revolution which overthrew Batista in January of 1959. A young lawyer named Fidel Castro led that revolution. And at first, Many people praise Castro for bringing about social reforms to Cuba and improving the economy. But just like with Hitler and with Stalin, he was a harsh dictator. He suspended elections, he jailed Cuba or executed his opponents, and tightly controlled the press. Does all this sound familiar? When Castro nationalized the Cuban economy, he took over U.S. owned sugar mills and refineries. And in response, President Eisenhower ordered an embargo on all trade with Cuba. Now, this embargo was in place until just a few years ago. Um, in Castro then turned to the Soviets for economic and military aid, and in 1960, the CIA started to train anti-Castro Cuban exiles. So Castro had exiled, these people who did not agree with him. And sound familiar again? And in April 1961, they invaded Cuba, landing at the Bay of Pigs. However, the United States didn't provide the hoped, well, they thought they were going to get air support. And the U.S. did not end up providing that air support. And so Castro's forces easily defeated the invaders. And really, it was very humiliating for the United States. It was a quite the humiliating loss to be losing to these people. So the failed Bay of Pigs invasion convinced then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that the U.S. would not resist Soviet expansion in Latin America. So in July 1962, Khrushchev secretly began to build 42 missile sites in Cuba. Now think about how close Cuba is to the United States. It's not very far. In October, an American spy plane discovered those sites. Now we're at President Kennedy. President John F. Kennedy declared that missiles so close to the U.S. were a threat. He demanded the removal and also announced a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the Soviets from installing any more missiles. But Castro and Cuba were deeply involved. Kennedy's demand for the removal of Soviet missiles put the United States and Soviet Union on a collision course. People around the world were fearing nuclear war. Fortunately, though, after 13 days, which it was a very stressful 13 days in the United States, we really thought that we were going to be attacked. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in return for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. So the United States had to, pinky swear that they weren't going to invade Cuba. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis left Castro completely dependent on Soviet support. And in exchange for this support, Castro backed communist revolutions in Latin America and Africa. Soviet aid to Cuba, however, ended abruptly with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So 1991, remember, is also when the Cold War is going to end. So just hold on to that thinking. This loss dealt a crippling blow to the Cuban economy, and eventually Castro loosened state control of Cuba's economy and sought better relations with other countries. However, they still did not have better relations with the U.S.
And even more direct threat to American security began to unfold on October the 14th, 1962, when American U-2 surveillance planes flying over Cuba made a discovery.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that the Soviets would introduce nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba, targeted on the eastern part of the United States. They never had moved nuclear weapons off the soil of the Soviet Union. We didn't believe they would. They did.
It was my father's decision and his own idea. It was only one reason: to show that we are great power and we will protect all our allies, and if anybody will try to fight against our allies, that will mean beginning of the Third World War.
The Cuban Missile Crisis would last for 13 days that October. The president and his most trusted advisors tried to figure out how to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba.
As far as the president was concerned, this was a superpower confrontation. It was the Soviets who would put nuclear missiles in Cuba. It was the Soviets who would have to remove them.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The U.S. military was put on the maximum level of alert, DEFCON 2. The president ordered the Navy to mount a blockade around Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers.
For 72 hours, the world watched and waited as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line.
They kept coming, they kept coming, they kept coming, they kept coming. So there would be these days of incredible tension. Millions of Americans believed that they were about to die. We literally sat and talked about the fact that we were living then out in the wilds of New Jersey, and were we far away from New York City to survive?
So you can see it was a very stressful 13 days for the United States. Very little people rested in that 13 days. They really did think that they were going to be their last days. So let's go to the Middle East now. The Middle East was valuable to the U.S. and the Soviets because it was full of countries that were full of oil. And so for several years following World War II, Afghanistan maintained its independence from both neighboring Soviet Union and the United States. In the 1950s, however, Soviet influence in the country began to increase, and in 1978, a communist group took control of the Afghan government. Now, the Afghanis felt that communist policies conflicted with the teachings of Islam. A group of Muslim rebels fought against the Afghans' communist government, and this revolt resulted in a Soviet invasion in 1979. Now, the Soviets expected to prop up the Afghan communists and quickly withdraw. They were like, we're gonna get in, get out, be done. Instead, just like the United States was dealing with in Vietnam, the Soviets found themselves stuck. And like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, rebel forces outmaneuvered the military superpower and supplied with American weapons the Afghan rebels called Mujahideen or Holy Warriors. They fought on. The United States had armed the rebels because they considered the Soviet invasion a threat to Middle Eastern oil supplies. So now we're at President Jimmy Carter. Now, President Carter warned the Soviets against any attempt to gain control of the Persian Gulf. To protest the invasion, he stopped U.S. grain shipments to the Soviet Union and ordered a U.S. boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Now, I'm going to tell you, the boycott of the Olympics was a big deal. In the 1980s, the new Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, acknowledged the war's devastating cost. He withdrew all Soviet troops by 1989. But by then, internal unrest and economic problems were tearing apart the Soviet Union itself. So this is 1989. The Soviet Union is starting to somewhat fall apart, right? So let's watch this video.
In Geneva today, after more than 7 years of war, an agreement on Afghanistan. The United States, the Soviet Union, Pakistan, and the Afghan government signed a piece of paper which is really a face-saving way for the Soviets to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan. There is no guarantee that it will actually lead to peace. ABC's Rick Inderfirth is in Geneva to cover the signing.
The UN-sponsored accord took 6 years to negotiate, 17 minutes to sign. The United States and the Soviet Union will serve as guarantors of the agreement, hence the presence today of Secretary of State Shultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. The accord calls for the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 9 months, beginning May 15th, the return of the nearly 5 million Afghan refugees displaced by the war, and a pledge of non-interference in Afghanistan's internal affairs.
The stage has now been set for the Afghan people to determine their own future, free of Soviet forces.
We welcome the signing of the Geneva Agreements because they put an end to outside interference in Afghanistan's affairs.
Despite these statements, today's agreement is not expected to end the fighting in Afghanistan. Indeed, there is no provision in the accord calling for a ceasefire between the warring parties. The Afghan resistance fighters, or Mujahideen, refused to take part in the UN talks, vowing to overthrow the communist regime in Kabul. Moreover, both the United States and the Soviet Union have said they will continue supplying military aid to their respective allies in the conflict if the other side does so. Today's agreement cannot, therefore, be labeled a peace treaty for Afghanistan. But with Soviet troops now formally committed to leaving, the necessary first step in resolving the 9-year-old war has been taken. Rick Inderfirth, ABC News, Geneva.
All right. So I hope that you're starting to get an idea of why Afghanistan is in the condition that they're in today. And it goes as far back as 1979. And they're still fighting the same war today. The unrest and all of that is actually what leads to the ability of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups to kind of take root in Afghanistan. So that's all we have for today. You'll see that we're at 1989, and you know that the Cold War will end in 1991. So our next lesson is going to be the end of the Cold War and moving forward. So I hope you have a very wonderful long holiday weekend. Please remember that Memorial Day is all about honoring those soldiers and veterans who have fought to defend our freedoms, and make it a great day.